Hello, this is Bruce Bewald with Synapse Energy Economics, and this is our November webinar. Today's topic is municipalization, local electricity, the prudent and principled way. We've done 3 of these monthly webinars so far. I think maybe some of you have been on those. Topics including nuclear power, clean energy analysis, and energy efficiency cost effectiveness. And next month in December, we'll be back on the 21st, so the third Thursday at 2 o'clock. You can mark your calendars. We have not yet picked a topic, so if you have something you want to hear about, feel free to email us and suggest things you'd be interested in for either December or future webinars. So welcome. Logistically, during this webinar, if you have questions, please email them. So I'm talking about substantive questions for the presenters. You can email us at webinar@synapse-energy.com. So we will be fielding those questions while the presenters speak. If you have technical questions, the sound or the chat, the webinar's not working for you, then use the chat feature to notify the host, and we'll see if we can get that fixed in the WebEx software. But substantive questions to webinar@synapse-energy.com. You will be muted, so that we find it works better if the participants are muted, but email questions, and we'll make sure they get asked. I think we're going to put most of the questions today at the end, other than clarifying questions as we go along. So basically our agenda today is going to, our presenters are Jenn, Kallay, and Tommy Vitolo, Synapse Energy Economics, and they're going to talk about their experience with municipalization, municipal utilities. Jenn is going to lead off. She's going to talk about basically what a muni is. She's going to give an overview of the landscape, what's going on in the U.S. with electric municipalization, and then she's going to outline a 4-step framework for thinking in a clear and coherent way about whether to municipalize. It can be a complicated topic, a daunting and challenging process if you choose to go through, and you should think it through in a careful and systematic way, whether it's actually for you. And then Tommy's going to talk about a couple of case studies, in particular a case study of Springfield, Illinois, and another of Georgetown, Texas. In Springfield, Tom will explain why what they're doing looks good on the surface but has problems when you dig underneath. And in Georgetown, Texas, it's vice versa, where things look a little questionable initially, but then when you look at what's really going on, it fits well with the community's goals and objectives. We've got about an hour for this, so let's dive in. Take it away, Jenn.
Thank you very much, Bruce. So we are going to refer to municipal utilities today as munis throughout this presentation. So it really makes sense to ensure that we're all on the same page as to what this term means up front. So you're probably familiar with some communities and the fact that they're served by investor-owned utilities. So these are large companies, they're accountable to their stakeholders, and they're generally regulated by state public utility commissions. The way munis function is quite different from this. So they are publicly or community-owned and operated. And when I say the word community, I mean that they're owned by a city or town, but a community can also be a county. It could be a public utility district, which could include multiple towns or cities, or it can be an entire state. And typically they're run and regulated by elected or appointed government officials. So in this sense, management is in town. There's a building in your town down the street where your utility is based. You can walk down the street and walk right in the door. So there are a few things. So another element is that they can provide more services. They can provide water service, sewer service, trash removal service, telecommunications, and then they also can provide energy services, which could include electric or natural gas services. And the scope of our work at Synapse is generally focused on energy services, so our discussion of municipalization today will be mostly through an energy-focused lens. They can also own more assets, so when you think of an IOU in a deregulated sense, as providing distribution services, but a muni can own and operate generation and transmission as well as distribution services. And I just want to clarify that what we're talking today is about munis. This is not the same as rural electric cooperatives or co-ops. So this topic is especially relevant. Municipalization efforts are attracting more notice and interest, but it's really important that we can start by contextualizing this landscape. So what we've seen is that municipalization is actually quite rare in recent years. Just 2% of the 900 energy service providers that can be classified as munis have municipalized since 1990. Additionally, communities with municipal utilities are generally quite small. So think populations of about 15,000 or less. And we'd be doing you quite a disservice with our presentation if we didn't indicate that municipalization is generally a long and complex process. So it's something to be aware of, and we try to simplify that today to the extent we can. Lastly, communities that have municipalized are actually quite diverse. They're diverse geographically. There are municipals in states across the country. They're diverse socioeconomically, and they also can be rural or urban. Further, they're driven to municipalize by a variety of factors, including reliability, local control, and innovation, including the desire to utilize more clean energy.
And I would just jump in and point out that state law often has a big impact on the process by which a community could municipalize and the prospects of its success. And so if we look at the municipalization efforts across the country, they're infrequent, but they do tend to clump at several states that have, intentionally or not, made the process more hospitable for communities interested in going down that road.
That's a great point, Tommy. So the purpose of my portion of the presentation is to provide you with a complete roadmap of the municipalization process in a digestible and succinct format. So this information is not necessarily new, but it is kind of in disparate locations. And so we bring it together in one consolidated location, and it's organized in a clear way to facilitate towns and communities that want to think about municipalizing. We hope this will help you by providing complete knowledge up front, ensuring comprehensive planning, improving your preparedness and likelihood for success. And by success, I mean achieving your goals without surprises or setbacks, whether or not municipalization is a solution that's right for you. It also emphasizes community awareness and buy-in and operational transition. And we find that these are two aspects of municipalization that are often not given quite enough attention. And we hope also to better prepare communities to think about partnerships, coordination, and collaboration where those are possible and appropriate. And so we have a number of steps. We group the steps into 4 phases to really help it be digestible. The first phase is investigation, followed by acquisition, followed by transition, and the final phase is fruition. And all of these phases are important, but not all of them require equal time and resources to complete. So in phase 1, investigation, you will determine whether to proceed with municipalization. And I want to point out on the next 4 slides are actually quite text heavy. I am not going to walk through all the text on these slides. Really the purpose is for you to have a complete and comprehensive kind of take-home document should you like to take this away with you. So this is more for you. I am going to walk through this at a much higher level. So this can include, considering whether to proceed with municipalization includes a really important step, which is identifying your goals and potential options to address those goals. These options may include municipalization, but municipalization may in fact not be the tool you need to solve the issues at hand, so keep that in mind. It also involves assessing technical, legal, and economic feasibility, providing community education, and holding votes or referendums which will allow the community as a whole to decide whether to move forward. And in this phase, it is critical to identify kind of a leader or group that can shepherd the effort forward, and certainly if you decide to municipalize beyond, then you will need that group as well. And it's important, really, one of the key features coming out of this is that it's important not to work in isolation. It's important to involve the community and keep the community apprised of what is going on and what are the findings along the way.
Jen, before you move on, can you expand a little bit on some of the goals that communities might have, the potential goals? I think it's really important that the community work out what they're trying to achieve before they even go forward, because if you can't agree on your goals, then how are you going to go through this whole process? If you can agree on a few goals, maybe that can help direct the process. But what are some of the goals that communities have expressed or might express that bring them in this direction?
So there are a number of goals, and communities sometimes start out with one goal and then realize that their goals are more multifaceted over time. But we have heard communities that are looking for improved reliability. Certainly lower prices can be a goal. Stable prices can be a goal. More recently, greener power and wanting to move at either a faster pace than the IOU is willing to move, or to go deeper and have more renewables than the IOU is willing to tackle. And local economic development is also big, so having more local control and being able to really drive development in town with the utility behind that. Oh, another one we ran into is undergrounding wires. So sometimes capital improvements could drive a desire to want to municipalize. So when you're under an IOU, you're subject to kind of a priority list that includes other communities, and to the extent that other communities have capital investment needs that might be higher priority than yours, you will be below them. But if you have your own muni, then you can prioritize your projects as you see fit.
Thank you.
So going to phase 2, this is the acquisition phase. So at this point, you've decided to municipalize. You're all in. So now you want to confirm what you're buying, how much it's going to cost you, and what condition it's in. In this phase, you'll seek to attain the ownership of the IOU's assets. This includes some significant interaction now with the IOU, especially as you negotiate for those assets. And it is often the case that the IOU at this point is not very happy with you, and in many cases is actively opposing you. So you want to be prepared with a strategy to address that opposition head on. In the transition phase, this is one of the most important phases to be aware of up front, and I feel that a number of towns don't give enough planning and thinking about this phase early on. So the transition phase is all about, so you've already purchased the assets, and now you are in charge. You are now responsible for keeping the lights on. And in general, towns and town officials do not have a large knowledge base in energy services and energy management. So these are not skills that people in town typically have. And so it tends to be a rather significant ramp up to acquire these skills, bring them into the town. It's either hired in, or again, you need to ramp up that knowledge in some way, shape, or form. So this is quite significant, and planning in advance for this transition of operations is important. In this phase, you'll need to procure the power, figure out where you're going to get your power from, maintain your system, which involves figuring out what the capital improvement plan was, and then deciding if you want to continue in that way or make significant changes. Thinking about where you're going to get your technical and management resources, both for the utility and then the linemen that work actually in the distribution system on a day-to-day basis. Managing daily operations, and that also includes how you'll interact with community members and representatives of various community divisions and departments directly in the town.
And I'm going to echo Jen's earlier point that transition is a real challenge for some municipalization processes, and you can think about it like the dog that sees the car drive by, right? The dog sees the car, right? That's investigation. I see that car, I want it. And then the dog puts all of its energy into acquisition. It's racing after that car. What does it do when it catches it, right? And that's transition. Folks are working so hard at investigation and acquisition, and it's such a challenge, and it's so difficult, requires so many resources. They get that victory, and they are entirely unprepared for the 5-second by 5-second challenge of maintaining electric power reliability throughout the entire community. And so we just really want to emphasize, once it's yours, and you need to keep it, and you need to keep it fully functioning right out of the gate. And that can be a real challenge, particularly if the former owner of those facilities is not thrilled with no longer being the owner and not especially interested in helping you operate this equipment that you now own. So,
And there are two elements to that, Tommy. One is that so when they actually sever the system, there may be, the system may no longer be functioning in the way it was previously, and you may need to fix that. And the other element is that capital improvements maybe weren't happening as frequently as they should have been, and your system is really not where it needs to be. So there may be reliability issues caused by that you need to deal with right away. So those are two issues you want to be thinking about going into this phase.
You bet.
And the last phase is one that we identified that I haven't seen talked about a lot, but I think is really, really important. Mostly because, to Tommy's point, there's a lot of energy spent thinking about investigating municipalization, acquiring the assets, transitioning. Certainly, once you get to, you're successfully kind of operating on a day-to-day basis, you want to think about where you're going. You want to make sure, first of all, that you have proper oversight in place. So remember that municipal utilities are not regulated in the same way an IOU is, and so, but they do need to be regulated. There does need to be oversight so that the community remains in line, their values remain in line with what the utility is doing. So it's very important to establish that. It's also important to establish regular check-ins, touch base to assess finances, operations, and management. So you want to make sure that there's a process to keep in line with what's going on. And the last piece is innovation. There's a huge opportunity. You now have the flexibility to innovate, to take the utility in the direction the town would like to go. That could be certainly along where it's been in the past, but it could also be a different direction. And so it's definitely in this phase to consider the long term and where you'd like to head. So in conclusion, one thing I want you to take away from today's presentation is that though I've presented this as a roadmap, it's certainly not one path leading to a single outcome. Some steps of this process may be more relevant to some communities than others, and some communities will spend more time and effort in certain areas than others. Also, this is not meant to suggest a certain sequence or order of events. Communities should follow the steps in a sequence that is best for them and makes sense. A variety of paths and outcomes is not problematic. It's reasonable and appropriate to see this in municipalization. And it's driven in part by the very principles behind what it means to be a muni. And those principles are local preferences and priorities, and the flexibility to customize solutions to meet local needs. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Tommy.
Good afternoon. Tommy Vitolo. I want to start by giving some preliminary thoughts on the fruition phase, the steady state operation of a municipal electric utility. The first observation is that munis are political entities. Investor-owned utilities are not, co-ops in fact are not, but munis are political entities, and therefore they may represent the values of their respective communities. They need not, but in my opinion, they ought to, right? They have the ability to, and if they don't represent the values of their communities, whose values are they representing? The second thought is that the data necessary to measure and analyze municipal electric behavior and decisions is available, but it's not always so easy to get, and it's certainly not all in one place. And so being able to find all of that information and put it together to measure whether or not the muni is doing the things it thinks it's doing or says it's doing, and how well it is doing them can be tricky, but it's certainly possible. And in light of that, muni decision-making and operations are not always what they seem. And so we're going to start by looking at City Water, Light, and Power in Springfield, Illinois. Springfield's a population of about 110,000. It's the capital of Illinois, and it's the home of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. And this is what CWLP looks like from a high level. They've got some residential customers and some commercial customers, and about 5% of sales are directly to the state of Illinois because the state capital is indeed located there. In terms of generation capacity, they've got about 150 megawatts of CTs and a 4-unit coal-fired Dallman Station. 31 and 32 are twin units and the oldest. 33 came later, and Dallman 4 came online in 2009. And as you can see, Dallman 4 is doing the heavy lifting, but all 4 of the coal units operate to produce just about as much power as the utility needs. Because CWLP is located in MISO, they have the ability to overgenerate and to sell that excess power to the market, as well as to undergenerate and buy the needed power from the market. At any given time, they could be buying or selling, and from a practical perspective, if Dallman stopped working entirely, the lights would not go out. They would just purchase all of their needs from MISO. Revenues and expenses are critically important, and good news, revenue exceeds both the operational expenses and the debt payments for each of the last 5 years. This utility is operating in the black. That's great news if you're mayor. It's also great news if you're a bondholder, right? We need our munis and all of our power companies to be generating at least as much revenue as their expenses on an ongoing basis if we want them to continue operating. But it turns out that things are not so rosy. I remind you that the revenue comes from the ratepayers. But the question that's important to ask is, are those ratepayers getting good value for their money? And so what we did is we asked the question, what if the Dallman units, rather than produce electricity for the customers, just produced it for the market? What if this was a merchant plant whose sole job was to make money? Well, it would sell the energy and capacity to the market, but it would have to buy fuel, pay for variable O&M, and pay for fixed O&M. And so when we think about it this way, it could have sold its energy and its capacity on the market and made, in the case of Dallman 31, about $60 million over that entire time period in energy and about $6 million in capacity. But it would have had costs. It would have had to pay for coal, right? And that cost about $50 million over the time period. You'll notice 2008 has no energy and capacity revenue, nor no fuel or variable O&M costs, because it wasn't operating that year. It was broken. But it still had fixed O&M costs. And so variable O&M, variable operation and maintenance costs, are costs that are accumulated as you operate the plant. So, for example, some of the labor. Another example would be the reagents or chemicals associated with burning the coal. And so those costs grow as you use the plant more. But fixed O&M costs, you own on January 1st of the year whether or not you operate the plant for 1 hour or 8,000 hours. Examples could be taxes, if it pays taxes, or pilots, payments in lieu of taxes in the case of a municipal-like plant. Insurance, some of your labor, like security, you're going to pay them to make sure no one's messing around with your plant, whether or not it's operating. And so we have fixed and variable costs. And when we add up all of the costs and compare it to the revenue, we see that in the case of Dallman 31, it has lost money each and every year. Its existence has cost CWLP millions of dollars a year. They'd have been better off if it had floated away. Dallman 32 is a little better because in 2008 it was operational, and you see it did very well with its energy revenue. The energy market paid heavily in 2008, and it was a profitable plant in 2008, at least in the earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization perspective, which is essentially the cash flow perspective. So it was a good plan in 2008. It made $5 million, but you can see every year after that it lost money. But 31 and 32 are the old small units. Surely 33 and 4 did better. They did not. They actually, because they were bigger, managed to lose even more money. Dallman 4 didn't lose any in 2008. It hadn't come online until 2009. But you can see from 2009 until 2016, Dallman 33 and Dallman 4 have also lost money each and every year. And the problem is not that they're running the plant when they shouldn't. After all, the energy revenue consistently exceeds the fuel cost and variable O&M cost. They're dispatching the unit when they should be. The problem is, every January 1st, they choose to operate the unit for another year and pay that giant fixed O&M cost, and they're never able to recover it with the revenue from the energy and capacity markets. And so all 4 of these units keep losing money. How much are we talking? We're talking about $261 million in 9 years spread across 110,000 residents. It's a huge chunk of money for a relatively small community.
And what's fascinating too, Tommy, is the consistency of this trend over such a, what is a relatively long period of time.
Well, that's right. And the reason is that if we think back to that first slide where the revenue's exceeding the cost. So it looks like they're doing fine, right? They're able to pay their bills. That's the good news. The bad news is the way that they're able to pay their bills is by charging residential and commercial customers, and of course the state of Illinois, who they're probably less sympathetic about, far more than they need to be. In fact, residential bills are on the order of $200 a year higher than they would be if the Dallman units just floated away. Commercial customers are paying $2,000 to $3,000 more a year because CWLP is operating these coal units instead of just leaving them alone.
And for homeowners in small towns and small businesses, this is a substantial amount.
This is shocking. If this coal plant were owned by an investment bank in Chicago, it would turn off tomorrow. It would just close, and all of the workers would get pink slips, and they'd have 2 weeks of pay, and they'd be off to find another job, unlikely to find a job that pays as well and provides the quality benefits that working for a municipality provides. And it's worth noting, I just want to diverge just a minute, we talked about how municipal light plants can represent the values of their constituencies, the political values. And I can tell you that the people of Springfield, Illinois want to take care of the civil servants who have been working to keep their lights on all these years. They don't want to just fire them, and they don't have to. In the case of Dallman Station, there are about 130 employees who are at retirement age or within 5 years of retirement age. And that means CWLP can very gracefully redeploy its existing workforce to allow the folks who are ready to retire, and the ones who are a few years away, they could buy them out. After all, we're talking about saving $30 or $40 million a year. They can afford to buy them out and make sure that they land, I don't want to call it a golden parachute, but that they land comfortably. They don't need to lay anyone off. They can be very careful. They can reassign workforce. They can retrain workforce. They can take care of their employees in a way that an IOU wouldn't be allowed to, at least not with ratepayer money. But CWLP can do that, and I hope that they recognize that that's an important thing. That would represent my values. I know, having been to Springfield several times, that it represents the values of the people who I spoke with when I was there. So that's the example of Springfield, Illinois. CWLP, things looked rosy, but when we looked under the hood, it turned out they can't ever get that $261 million back, but they don't need to keep losing money, and we're hopeful that they'll come to terms with that really challenging problem. And one of the reasons it's challenging is because this is a municipal light plant, which means this is an asset. It's a resource owned by the city. It's like a library or a park. And if you're minding the store, if you're a city councilor or an alderman, you're not going to be the one who sells the library or closes the parks. That's not what you believe in, right? And what's important for the decision makers to remember is that the power plant is not like a library. The power plant is like a pickup truck owned by the DPW. It's a tool, it does a job, and when it stops being an effective way to do its job, you get rid of it because the goal is not doing the job, the goal is serving the people. So now I want to get into Georgetown Utility Systems in Georgetown, Texas. It's a great little town of about 60,000 people. It's a city about 30 miles north of Austin. It's a very conservative community, and this is just some examples of that. But I want to emphasize that because munis have the ability to represent their constituencies, and the constituency that they would have in Georgetown, Texas, the Georgetown Utility Systems constituency, is indeed quite conservative. And so we would in fact hope that the utility system recognizes and respects that reality and behaves in a way that best represents their constituency while still providing safe, reliable power at low rates. And so back in 2011, they were buying their power from the Lower Colorado River Authority, which was a muni generation and transmission organization created by the state of Texas to provide power to dozens of munis in central Texas many years ago, in the 30s or the 40s, I believe. And so the Lower Colorado River Authority has some hydro, a big chunk of natural gas, almost 1,600 megawatts, and over 1,000 megawatts of coal in terms of generating capacity. By actual energy, coal represented about 2/3 of their generation, with natural gas making up most of the rest. And Georgetown Utility Systems customers at that time, about 25% industrial and the rest split between residential and commercial. Their wholesale power prices had been declining for a few years. They'd gone from a little over $80 to about $60 in 2016 dollars. So things looked pretty good, but 2012 was an important year because there was a chance to change power supplies. The Lower Colorado River Authority has 25-year contracts, and 2011 and 2012 was the time period in which the GUS, the Georgetown Utility System, had the opportunity to re-sign or to go a different direction. And so Georgetown took some time and thought about what are their goals, what are their objectives. And they stated clearly, we want low prices and we want stable prices. We're a community with many retirees, and we think long-term price stability is especially important. And we're averse to long-term risk. We want things to go as planned for as long as possible. And so they shopped around, and there were 3 different places they could get their energy and capacity. One was the Lower Colorado River Authority, which offered low prices, but their prices are variable. They couldn't offer a fixed price because their fuel costs change in ways they can't accommodate, and they're balancing the requirements of a variety of munis. But we're going to lock them into a 25-year contract. They do have a diverse fuel supply, so that's good news if you want long-term risk aversion. And they had support continuously from the Texas legislature and the federal government, and that's also great news if you're worried about long-term risk. So good on low prices, not so great on stable prices, and so-so on long-term risk aversion. Merchant generators were offering low prices, that's great. 7-year fixed price PPAs with natural gas. So some stability, but after 7 years, who knows what's going to happen. And in terms of risk aversion, again, you get some early risk aversion, but after that, you're rolling the dice again. Renewables were a very different direction. They had higher prices, not high, but higher. But they were offering 20 and 25-year fixed prices for wind and solar PPAs. So that's both stable and providing long-term risk aversion. So we have 3 different possibilities. All of them met some of the goals. None of them met all of the goals. And the GUS had to figure out what to do. And so we would expect they would go with LCRA. It's the conservative choice. It's sort of go along, get along. It's worked for them for a long time. Merchants might have been attractive. It's sort of, you can imagine, the Texas way, right? Energy buying and selling is very, very, very Texas. But they didn't. They did something really unexpected and something different than the 6 other municipalities who also chose not to rebid on LCRA did. They went 100% renewable. So by capacity, that's about 150 megawatts of solar and about 150 megawatts of wind. By energy, it's windier in Texas than it is sunny, as it turns out. It's about 2/3 of the energy coming from wind and 1/3 from solar. And look at that power price. It's been flat and, in fact, recently declining. So not only did they get long-term stability, not only did they get risk aversion because they don't have to worry about, at the time they were worried about Obama's war on coal, but they don't have to worry about the federal government coming in or even the state government coming in and giving Lower Colorado River Authority a hard time about pollution controls or emissions, or doesn't worry about any of that, because wind and solar, they've got the contract locked in, and there's no long-term risk that those are going to be problems, or at least very small risk. So they really nailed it. And what's remarkable is, again, this is a community that you wouldn't expect would come out and say 100% renewable energy. That's where we're going. And in fact, there was some internal debate about whether or not to even tell folks right away that their long-term power contracts were with wind and solar. They were a little worried about saying it. But their mayor, Dale Ross, has run with it. And this, I want to tell you about Mayor Dale Ross. He's a Republican who won, I think, 73% of the vote in his last election, and he's a CPA. This is a conservative guy who has conservative values and believes in them, and he thinks carefully about them. And here are some of the things Mayor Dale Ross has had to say in the past few years about his community's decision to go 100% renewable and how it aligns with his community's values. And so this was a great case of a community that didn't look like it was making a decision that was consistent with its values or consistent with what we would expect a muni to do. In fact, its peers all did something entirely different. But when we looked under the hood, we discovered they did exactly what made sense for them and their values. They got low prices, they got price stability, and that was really important for economic development. That was really important for the retirees who lived in the community. So we thought this was a great example of a municipality in the fruition phase that looked like they weren't getting it right, but in fact, they nailed it.
Thanks, Tommy. Thanks, Jen. I have a question about you're both active in local government where you live, and I'm wondering how that shapes your views on municipalization and what you've been telling us about today.
So the town I live in is actually has its own municipal electric utility, and so what I've learned through that, which is I think is not obvious to the community. First of all, a lot of people in the community don't even know that we have a municipal electric utility, which is so important. The other aspect is that it does require community involvement over the long term. So it is something that that involvement, sustained involvement over time, not just, again, during municipalization, but even beyond that, is something that is extremely important and something that I'm not seeing enough of today. So I feel like the community needs to be very involved in decision-making because they do have a choice and they have a real impact. That decision that they make actually can be implemented immediately, and the utility has the flexibility to do that.
That's right. I'm a town meeting member in my town. In fact, we wrapped up our town meeting, our special town meeting last night at about 11:30. So I'm still a little sleepy, but we got the business of the town done. My town does not have a municipal electric utility. We're customers of the local IOU, which has service across New England. But I work with folks who care about environmental issues locally through my work as a town meeting member. And I have two concerns about folks wanting to municipalize to achieve community goals. One is, are you, the folks who are excited about it now, prepared for the transition and the fruition stages? Are you prepared to keep going to the meetings and to hold your own community's feet to the fire when they're not doing the things that you would hope they would do. It's easy to throw rocks at, you know, the big power company's executive who wears expensive suits and makes a ton of money, and they're not doing a good job and they should do better. It's a lot harder when it's your duty as a citizen to go to those 8:30 a.m. or 8:30 p.m. weekday meetings and hold your neighbors, who are the members of those boards, feet to the fire to do the right thing, or to step up and be that board member and be that volunteer person in your government who is, in fact, holding their feet to the fire. The other thing I would add is, in many cases, the requirements placed on IOUs are more stringent than on munis, particularly with respect to environmental requirements, right? So my community is required to meet the renewable portfolio standard, and so we have some fraction of renewable power minimum by state law, but Jen, your community is not required to.
Correct.
And may, in fact, choose not to, right? And so I would suggest that if you're interested, if you have a particular value and you think that your IOU is not meeting that value, check and make sure that that's not true. And then also see if becoming a muni makes you feel like you're more or less likely to achieve those values, because in fact, it may be less likely if you're not careful.
Thanks. So Tommy, when you travel to these places like Springfield, Illinois, and Georgetown, Texas, what do you eat? What would you recommend that our listeners eat if they find themselves in these?
One of the things I love about this job, Bruce, is traveling to places I would not be able to convince my wife or kids we ought to go visit. And Springfield, Illinois, and Georgetown, Texas are both great examples. Springfield, Illinois is right in the middle of Illinois. It's not so easy to get to. It's a wonderful community when you get there, though. And whenever I'm there, I try very hard to get down to Darcy's and eat a horseshoe, which is the local dish. It's probably 6,000 calories and a third of a heart attack. It's Texas toast, and then some French fries, and then meat of choice, and then kind of a cheesy gravy on top. It's delicious. And if you're in Georgetown, Texas, it's really easy. You ought to be eating grits and biscuits every morning for breakfast and barbecue for lunch and dinner every single day.
Good to know. So I'm under the impression that there's increased interest in municipalization in the States these days, in our communities in the United States. And is that true? And and so why?
It definitely seems that way. And certainly there have been some, I guess, higher profile municipalization efforts going on that have attracted a lot of attention. But I think we've definitely heard that local towns and cities are feeling like they're more distant from the headquarters of their utility, especially as utilities seek to acquire one another and merge. They're not, in the town. And so there's this kind of sense of loss of local control and a desire to get that back. And the other element that I see is there's more energy choices today than there have been in the past, and communities want to make use of all those energy choices, and in some cases they're not able to convince their IOU to do so.
And I would add that sort of a pivot on each of the points you made. One, I think you're right, people feel like they're farther away. They also feel like they're farther away from, in many cases, from the political decisions made either at the state or the federal level. And so I think there are communities who feel like, right or wrong, that perhaps all of a sudden, maybe since November 2016, maybe since some other date, they're not able to affect the political process in a way that requires their IOU to behave in the way that their values represent. And so if you can't affect change at the federal level or the state level at the moment, it may feel really attractive to affect change locally by gaining control of your local utility. I think that's very real. And with respect to more choices, it's not just that there are more choices like solar and wind. It's also the case that over the years, the electricity market in many places has changed from what I think most people who are not in the industry imagine, which is the power company owns the power plant,
all the wires between the power plant and your house, the meter, and it's one company that does everything, when in fact, in many parts of the country, the generators and the transmission owners and the distribution owners are three separate entities, or three separate collections of entities. And so, whereas 50 years ago, it was hard to imagine a community having a muni, because they'd have to run a power plant, they'd have to own those long-distance wires, and how are we going to make all those big decisions? Today, in many parts of the country, being a muni means running the local wires outside your neighbor's houses and being able to use a marketplace to procure the energy and capacity and get it wheeled to your community. And so the entire job, the entirety of being a muni isn't as complex or as sort of overbearing as it used to be. And so I think that's also important.
And I certainly think as we move forward, there may be reliability issues with more extreme weather events. So the idea that when your power goes out, somebody that's just down the street might be a lot faster to get to the wires and fix them than somebody that's in another state, another city, that kind of thing. So there's certainly this idea of neighborhoods and being physically close to one another in those events.
And then I would go ahead and pile on. I think more customers are becoming more educated about energy options. Maybe it's social media and they hear more about what their friends and family members have as options. Maybe it's solar panels on roofs and electric vehicles, and the understanding that energy is more complex and there are more choices, and recognizing that their utility isn't providing them with that service or those choices. Customers are demanding more, and if their IOU is slow to step up to the plate and provide those offerings regardless of what they are, maybe it's net metering and the utility isn't interested in net metering. Maybe it's electric vehicle charging either at the home or charge stations around town. And the IOU just can't seem to get there, or the co-op can't seem to get there.
And in some cases, it's economic development, which is a big topic these days, and jobs.
You bet.
So wanting to drive that forward to reinvigorate towns and businesses in towns, and when you can offer a different rate or a different type of rate for a new business to draw them in, it is attractive and can be a way to encourage economic development.
And in fact, as we discussed in Texas, in Georgetown, one of Mayor Dale Ross's points was that offering green energy isn't important to every business that might want to show up, but it is a competitive advantage because some businesses want to be at a place where they have easy access to green energy, and if that's what they want, and if economic development is important to our community, let's offer that and reap those benefits.
Thanks. There's a lot of reasons to consider this, and even though
there be dragons.
there be dragons. Unknowns and some known challenges. So I have one more question for you about kind of the prospects for success, and are there certain types of communities that tend to succeed at this? And if so, what is it about those communities? What characteristics tend to bode well for this endeavor, if you have any opinion?
Well, we'd be very interested in analyzing that in more detail. So we haven't done a comprehensive analysis, I would say, of that, but we certainly can respond anecdotally. And we see a variety. So there's not really a successful community type. We can't really typecast a certain community as being ripe for municipalization or ideal. We see a lot of different flavors of it. We see a lot of different types of communities, as I said before. And so there's no recipe here, I guess, is what I would say. And I think one of the best recipes for, quote, again, success is to have a strong plan, know the steps fully, and go into it with your eyes wide open.
I think that's true, but I think there are some things that may be easy to notice after the process has happened, but hard to be able to use to predict what communities will go next or will be successful. I think communities often had a specific goal that was not aligned with the communities around them or the IOU as a whole. They wanted to achieve something in particular, and they could say what it is, and they could explain it clearly. And I think that's really important because it justifies this really disruptive, in fact, risky undertaking that's going to take tons of staff time from your civil servant, and it's going to require all this advocacy and so much heartache one way or another. So you got to have a reason for doing it, and I think it helps if you have a community that, frankly, isn't struggling with 2 or 3 other existential crises at the same time, right? I think that when a community is doing municipalization, it is likely the most important thing happening at City Hall for those 2 or 3 or 5 or 7 years it takes. If you've got some other existential crisis happening right now, there probably isn't the appetite to also take this on at the same time.
The timing is very important. I agree with that.
And since you mentioned timing, in several cases, we saw it in Georgetown, Texas, with just changing their energy provider, but we've seen it in other communities in terms of municipalization. The franchise maybe was up for renewal, or the IOU was just bought or sold. There was a particular moment in time where it was sort of a now, or maybe not never, but now or wait a generation moment, and that's sort of the reason why it would happen at this particular time. That's what gets people thinking about it at this particular time. So I don't know that we could use that kind of information and be able to project or forecast or even suggest which communities may look toward municipalization in the future. So I don't know that it's especially helpful for that, but it does help explain, at least in hindsight, maybe why certain communities did what they did.
So I have a question about kind of renewable energy, and we haven't really been talking about municipal aggregation, but can you think of ways that municipal aggregation, that what we're doing in Massachusetts these days, might compare with municipals and prospects for kind of, some of these local values, if it's green power, is that something that
sure.
you can comment on?
So municipal aggregation, I'm lost.
Aggregation.
I'm sorry, aggregation. Municipal aggregation, or community choice aggregation, as it's called in some places, exists in, I think, 4 states. Maybe it's as many as half a dozen. And each of them do it a little differently, so we want to be careful to not be too specific. We want to try to keep it fairly general. In Massachusetts, where community choice aggregation is a thing, it allows the community to decide the vendor that will sell it the energy. They still use the local IOU for the wires, and munis can't. It wouldn't make sense for a muni, right? This is for communities that have an IOU. They can choose a different energy provider, and the catch is that any given customer can opt out. Just as right now, every customer of an IOU can choose a third-party energy provider, that would remain true. It's just that the default would change. And one way that a community can change the default is to change to a default that's greener, maybe a little bit greener, maybe a lot greener. Maybe they will give customers a default option which is somewhat greener, but give each customer the option to go to 100% green. And of course, each customer has the opportunity to opt out. And the key is the distinction between opt-in and opt-out. If you've ever tried to, if you've ever walked around the neighborhood with your kids selling Girl Scout cookies, that's an opt-in model. You've got to convince every one of your neighbors to buy cookies, and they're so delicious that it's not so hard, but you still have to get them one at a time. But what if the model was everybody in your neighborhood is obligated to buy 4 packages of Thin Mints unless they tell you they don't want them? You'd sell more cookies, right? And so community choice aggregation is opt-out, which makes it more like municipalization without going through the process of buying all that stuff. But the flip side is you didn't buy all that stuff. You don't get to control it. So if the things that you care about relate to twin telephone poles clogging up your sidewalks,
can't fix that problem with community choice aggregation. If the thing you care about is burying those wires, you can't fix that with community choice aggregation. So it can help with renewable energy in some places, and it can be very effective, but there are other reasons to municipalize. I don't think that they're substitutes.
They're not substitutes, but I think it points out that there are options. So there are options besides municipalization to get to certain goals, and so those should be on the table and fully considered at that time.
So thanks, Jen, and thanks, Tommy. We're about out of time. Thanks to everyone on the line here listening. If we didn't get to your question, sorry. We may follow up later by email. In fact, if you think of questions after we hang up, feel free to send them along, and we'll be happy to answer them. Also, you should know we put recordings of the webinars today's and the past few webinars are online at synapse-energy.com/webinars, so you can get the recording or forward it along if you know someone who might be interested but missed it. Send them a link. And then lastly, next month, December 21st is the third Thursday, and we'll be back at 2. We're considering topics around electric vehicles, electrification, reliability, and resilience. So we haven't settled on a topic yet, but we definitely will, and we'll let you know what it is. So thanks for listening.
Thanks for having us, and I look forward to talking energy at the Thanksgiving table next week.
Nice.